The streets of the city were buzzing with life on a crisp autumn evening. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows on the pavement, a young woman, Alana Williams, walked briskly along the sidewalk, her mind preoccupied with the events of the day. She had just finished her final exam at the university, and the weight of the past few months was starting to lift off her shoulders. A small smile crept onto her lips as she remembered the encouraging words of her father earlier that morning. "You've worked hard, Alana. Don't let anyone dim your light," her father, Gerald Williams, had said, his voice filled with pride. Alana's father was a respected figure in the city, known for his work in civil rights and his role in various community initiatives. He had raised her as a single parent, instilling in her a sense of strength and resilience that she carried with her wherever she went. But as Alana made her way home, the serenity of the evening was about to be shattered. A police car pulled up alongside her, the siren blaring loudly, and the spotlight from the vehicle's overhead light flicked on. Alana's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just walking home, enjoying the rare moment of peace. But in an instant, the reality of the situation shifted. The cop who stepped out of the car, Officer James Mitchell, was a man known for his volatile temper and deep-seated prejudice. Alana had encountered him before, during a community protest when he had made condescending remarks towards her and the others. But this time it was different. The officer's cold eyes locked onto her, and without a word, he began to approach her. "Hey, you!" he barked, his tone harsh. "Where do you think you're going?" Alana stood frozen for a moment, the icy chill in the air making her feel exposed, vulnerable. She swallowed hard, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I'm just walking home, officer." "I don't know why you're stopping me," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Mitchell's gaze narrowed as he eyed her, his lips curling into a sneer. "Oh, I think I know exactly why you're out here. Someone like you doesn't belong in these parts." The words hit Alana like a slap in the face. She had grown up in the city, raised by a father who fought for equality and fairness, but here she was, being judged solely based on the color of her skin. She held her ground, refusing to back down. "Excuse me, sir," Alana said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a college student, and I have every right to be here." "You think you're better than me?" Mitchell sneered, stepping closer, his body language aggressive. "You don't belong here. And those clothes you're wearing? They look like something a criminal would wear." Alana felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She could feel the familiar tension rising, and despite her best efforts to stay calm, she couldn't ignore the sense of impending danger. She had dealt with racial profiling before, but it never failed to sting. Mitchell's hand hovered near his gun, and that's when Alana realized he wasn't just harassing her for fun. He was making an example of her, exerting his power in ways he felt were justified. The fear in her chest grew, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. With a quick breath, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, preparing to record the encounter. As she did, Mitchell's eyes locked onto her phone with a look of fury. "I said, don't make this difficult," he spat, stepping closer and snatching the phone from her hand. "Hey!" Alana protested, her voice rising in alarm. Without warning, Mitchell pushed her up against the police car, his hand on her shoulder as he turned her around roughly. Alana winced, but she refused to show any fear. She wasn't going to let him break her spirit. "Don't you dare resist," Mitchell growled, his breath hot on her neck. That's when everything shifted. Alana's phone rang in her pocket, and Mitchell looked down at it for a second, distracted. The phone buzzed again, But it wasn't just a call, it was a video message from her father. He had left her a voicemail earlier, just as she was about to walk out of the exam hall, reminding her to call him after she was done. She had almost forgotten to return the call, but something in her gut told her this was the moment. Alana answered the phone, her voice shaking with urgency. "Dad, I need your help. I'm being harassed by Officer Mitchell again." Her father's voice came through immediately, calm yet filled with authority. "Don't worry, Alana. Stay on the line. I'm on my way." The officer paused, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He was so used to the people he targeted backing down that he hadn't expected someone to actually call for help, especially not from someone with the authority her father held in the community. "Get back in your car and get out of here before things get ugly," Alana's father's voice crackled through the phone, and suddenly Mitchell wasn't sure what to do. The tension was palpable, and as Alana stood there, her heart racing, she knew that her father's words had the power to change everything. Alana stood still, her back pressed against the cold metal of the police car, her hands trembling slightly in the chilly evening air. The world felt heavy in that moment, every breath she took more difficult than the last. She could hear the faint buzz of her phone in her hand, the persistent ringing from her father's call filling the otherwise tense silence. Her father, Gerald Williams, was a force to be reckoned with. Known as one of the city's top civil rights advocates, his influence was far-reaching. He was the kind of man who fought tirelessly for justice, for what was right, no matter the cost. And now, as his daughter was being unjustly harassed by a police officer, it seemed that his reputation was about to do what words alone couldn't. He was coming for Mitchell, and the officer had no idea what was coming his way. Alana's grip on the phone tightened as she heard her father's voice again. "I'm on my way, Alana. Just stay calm. Don't let him provoke you." The calmness in her father's voice was enough to steady her own nerves. Despite the officer's threatening demeanor, she stood tall. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her any longer. She had fought too hard to get to where she was, and she wasn't about to let one racist cop destroy everything she had worked for. "I'm staying calm, Dad. But this man is dangerous. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." Alana's voice was firm, but she couldn't hide the fear that laced her words. Mitchell was pacing in front of her now, a malicious smile on his face. "You think your dad is going to save you?" he sneered, eyes narrowing as he regarded her. "He's just a man. And I'm the law. Remember that." Just as the words left his mouth, the sound of screeching tires filled the air, cutting through the tension like a hot knife through butter. The police car's engine roared to life, and Mitchell froze. Alana turned her head toward the sound, her heart leaping in her chest. A black SUV skidded to a halt, tires screeching against the wet pavement. The vehicle's tinted windows rolled down slowly, revealing a man dressed in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. Alana's father. "Mitchell," Gerald Williams said, his voice as cold as the night air. "Step away from my daughter." Alana felt a wave of relief wash over her as her father's commanding presence filled the air. Mitchell, for the first time in his life, seemed unsure. His eyes flicked from Gerald's unflinching gaze to the young woman standing before him. He had been so sure of his power, his authority, but now it was slipping away. "What is this?" "A private family matter, Mr. Williams." Mitchell sneered, though the edge in his voice was now laced with uncertainty. "No, officer, this is a lesson in respect," Gerald said, his voice not rising, but filled with so much authority that even the harsh winds seemed to bow to him. He took a few steps forward, closing the gap between him and Mitchell. "You've made a terrible mistake." Mitchell took a hesitant step back, his hand twitching toward his belt as if preparing to draw his weapon. But before he could act, the SUV door opened with a quiet thud, and out stepped two men in dark suits. Their expressions were hard and emotionless, their steps calculated as they approached the scene. Alana couldn't help but blink in confusion. Who were these men? One of the suited figures flashed a badge in front of Mitchell, his voice deep and unwavering. "You are under arrest for harassment, racial profiling, and misconduct. You're not going to intimidate anyone here." Mitchell's face turned pale. What? I didn't do anything wrong," he stammered. "Oh, you did," Gerald said coldly. "And you'll pay for it." Mitchell's hand shot up, but one of the suited men grabbed it and twisted it behind his back. The cop let out a sharp yelp as the man expertly cuffed him. "You're a disgrace to this uniform," the man growled, securing Mitchell's arms. "You should have thought twice before pulling this stunt." The suited man turned to Gerald, nodding respectfully. "Mr. Williams, we have everything under control. You can take your daughter home now." Alana felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had been so close to breaking, so close to allowing fear to take over. But now, as she looked at her father standing tall and proud, she felt nothing but gratitude. This wasn't just about her, it was about holding people like Mitchell accountable for their actions. "Thank you," Alana whispered, her voice shaky, but filled with appreciation. Gerald placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. This was never just about us. This was about making sure we stand up for what's right, no matter who the other person is." With a final glance at Mitchell, now subdued and being led toward the back of the SUV, Gerald turned to his daughter, his eyes filled with pride. "Let's get you home. We've got work to do." As they walked toward the SUV, Alana couldn't help but look back one last time at the scene. Mitchell's career was over, his reputation shattered by the very same power he had tried to use against her. But that wasn't the only thing that had changed. Alana could feel it deep in her bones. The world was a little less unfair tonight, and it was because her father wasn't afraid to challenge the system that had failed so many. Alana leaned back in the plush leather seat of the SUV, watching the flashing lights of the police station recede into the distance as they drove toward the comfort of her childhood home. The air in the car was thick with unspoken words, yet there was an undeniable sense of accomplishment, of righting a wrong that had lingered in the shadows for far too long. Gerald glanced over at his daughter, his eyes soft with concern. "Are you okay, Alana?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with an underlying urgency. She met his gaze, feeling a wave of emotion stir inside her. The terror she had felt just hours ago, when she thought Mitchell's hostility would overwhelm her, had now been replaced with something more potent, a sense of justice. The rush of adrenaline was fading, but it was being replaced by a steady resolve. "I'm fine, Dad," she said with a forced smile, but her voice betrayed her. "Just overwhelmed, I guess." Gerald's eyes softened. "I know, sweetheart. What happened today was beyond any parent's worst nightmare. But you handled yourself with strength and dignity." He let the words hang in the air, knowing they carried weight. Alana had always been strong, but today she had shown a courage he hadn't known was possible. The SUV sped through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. The sky was starting to lighten with the first blush of dawn. Alana's eyes wandered to the window, the lights of the city flickering like distant stars. Her father's phone buzzed on the dashboard. Gerald glanced at the screen, his expression darkening instantly. "It's them," he muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. Alana raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "The people who've been working with me to expose systemic racism in the force. The ones who've been watching Mitchell for months." Gerald's fingers curled around the phone, his jaw tight. This was supposed to be a warning. But now, we have to go all the way. Alana's heart skipped a beat. She knew that the journey they were on was just beginning. Mitchell was only the tip of the iceberg. She could feel the weight of what was ahead, the responsibility that her father carried, the storm that was about to hit the police department, and the entire city. "Do you think Mitchell's the only one?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with a new kind of resolve. Gerald glanced at her, surprised by the strength in her words. "No," he said, his voice steady. "And that's why we have to make sure this doesn't end with him. We need to make the system listen." The phone call had been brief, but the instructions were clear. Gerald was to meet with a group of activists, journalists, and legal experts who had been tracking Mitchell's behavior and the patterns of corruption within the local police force. The revelation of Mitchell's arrest was only the first step, and now it was time for action. Gerald and Alana arrived at an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that had seen its fair share of political meetings and covert dealings. The air inside was thick with tension, but also with an unmistakable sense of purpose. They were here for something bigger than themselves. As they stepped inside, the room went quiet. Several figures, cloaked in shadow, stood at the long table, a projector screen flashing behind them. The faces of the people who had been silently working behind the scenes to expose corruption in the police force were now in full view. There were lawyers, former officers, and even a few journalists who had been documenting the abuse for years. One of the men, a former detective named Richard, stood up. He was tall and thin, with sharp eyes that seemed to cut through the room. "We've got everything we need," he said, his voice low and steady. "Now, we take this to the people." Gerald nodded, his face grim. "We need a public statement. Something to make sure the city knows we're not stopping here. Mitchell isn't the only officer involved in this. We've been collecting evidence of similar abuse and violence. We need to show the public that this isn't just one bad apple. It's a rotten tree." Richard exchanged a glance with the others. "We've got the evidence. But you need to be prepared, Gerald. This could get ugly. The higher-ups won't just sit back and watch. This is the kind of thing that can make or break careers. The system will fight back." Gerald's lips curled into a tight smile. "I've spent my entire life fighting the system. This is nothing new." Alana stood to the side, watching the interaction unfold. There was no turning back now. The fight her father had been preparing for his entire life had just entered its most dangerous stage. But as she looked around the room, she felt a new sense of belonging. These people, these warriors for justice, had now become part of her fight. "I'm with you, Dad," Alana said softly, her voice steady. "We'll make sure Mitchell isn't the last." Gerald's eyes softened, but there was no time for sentiment. "We need a plan. They'll be coming after us soon. We've got one shot at this." Alana watched as the team began to prepare. The journalists were drafting press releases, while the lawyers gathered the legal documents that would ensure their victory. The next few hours passed in a blur as everyone worked together, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. And then, Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the plan was set in motion. The city was about to change. As Gerald stepped in front of the microphones, Alana stood beside him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks, gathering evidence, meeting with people who could make a difference. Now, it was time for the world to see the truth. Gerald's voice boomed as he addressed the crowd. Today, we begin a new chapter for this city. A chapter where the truth is no longer hidden, where racism is no longer allowed to thrive in our police departments or anywhere else. The reporters, cameras flashing, leaned in, hanging on every word. Gerald continued, his voice unwavering. Mitchell is not the only officer who has abused his power. But he is the first to be held accountable. We've collected evidence, and we will make sure that every officer involved in corruption and racial profiling will face justice. No one is above the law. Alana could feel the weight of his words, the promise they carried. This was bigger than just her or her father. It was about every person who had ever been wronged, every family who had ever felt the sting of systemic racism. The streets outside the police station were quiet, yet the tension that hung in the air was palpable. Rachel Harper stood at the window of her office, staring out into the gloom of the city streets. The faint hum of the evening traffic filled the silence, but the sound only made the weight on her chest heavier. She had been working non-stop for the past few days, piecing together the puzzle of what had happened, what had been going on behind the scenes, and what they were about to uncover. But tonight, everything felt different. The final pieces were in place, and the weight of their actions was starting to sink in. Rachel's mind kept replaying the events of the past few days, the stolen moments, the phone calls, the silent surveillance. She had thought of little else since the night when everything changed for Emily and Nathan. What started as a personal vendetta against Collins for his unjust treatment of Emily had grown into something much larger than any of them could have anticipated. It wasn't just one rogue officer causing harm. It was a network, a well-oiled machine of corruption that had festered beneath the surface for years. She knew they had to move quickly. Collins had been careful. Too careful. But there were cracks, and Rachel had found them. The truth they were about to uncover was damning, not just for Collins, but for everyone involved in the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. The door creaked open behind her, and Nathan Carter stepped into the room. His usually calm demeanor was clouded with something Rachel couldn't quite place. His eyes were sharper, more focused, and his jaw was clenched. He had always been the type to keep his emotions in check, but tonight there was no hiding the urgency in his steps. "Rachel," he said, his voice low but firm, "are you ready for this?" She turned to face him, her expression grim but resolute. "We don't have a choice anymore. We either do this now, or we lose everything." Nathan nodded, his gaze hardening. He placed a thick file on the table between them. "Here's what we've got. The surveillance footage from the night Emily was taken in, it's all here. But it's not just about Collins. There are others. People who were supposed to protect and serve." Rachel's eyes scanned the file quickly, but her mind was already racing ahead. She'd seen some of this footage before, but now, with Nathan's new information, the pieces fell into place. Collins had orchestrated the events surrounding Emily's arrest, and everything had been carefully planned. He had been waiting for the right moment to strike. But it wasn't just about Emily. Collins had been using his position to manipulate situations, framing people for crimes they didn't commit, and using his authority to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dared question him. But the most shocking revelation was the involvement of others within the department. The deeper Rachel dug, the more corrupt the system seemed to be. Collins had help, Rachel muttered, more to herself than to Nathan. This was a whole network, and we've only scratched the surface. I know, Nathan replied quietly, his gaze unwavering. But it's time to expose the whole thing. The question is, how do we get Collins to confess? He's smart, too smart to fall for anything obvious. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of the table. They had already gone over the evidence, meticulously piecing together every detail, but Collins wasn't going to go down easily. He had been trained for situations like this. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to avoid making mistakes. And worst of all, he knew exactly how to manipulate people's trust. I think I have an idea, Rachel said, after a long pause. She felt a shift in her chest, a realization settling in. But it's going to take both of us. Nathan raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. What are you thinking? Rachel stood up and paced the small room, her mind clicking into place. We've been working in the shadows, trying to get information without alerting Collins. But maybe it's time to flip the script. What if we let him think he's one step ahead? What if we bait him into revealing himself? Nathan didn't speak at first, his gaze flickering between Rachel and the file on the table. The idea was risky, dangerously so, but it was the only shot they had. Rachel's instinct was telling her it was the right move, but she also knew that one wrong move could end everything. They could lose the leverage they had so painstakingly built, or worse, they could put themselves in harm's way. Rachel continued, her voice firm. We let him think that we don't know everything. We make him feel like he has the upper hand. Then, when he's least expecting it, we close in. We use the footage, the reports, everything we've gathered. We make him confess, and we make sure that there's no way out for him. Nathan stood up from his chair, his posture straighter now. His decision was made. All right, we do it your way. But we need to move fast. Collins won't wait forever. Rachel nodded, a sense of determination flooding her chest. The stakes had never been higher. But they had to do this, not just for Emily, but for everyone Collins had hurt, for every person he had exploited, for every innocent life he had ruined with his abuse of power. It was time to take him down, and they weren't going to wait around any longer. As Rachel and Nathan prepared for the confrontation, Rachel's thoughts drifted back to the first time she had met Emily. So young, so full of hope, but with a heart that had been shattered by the unjust actions of the very people who were supposed to protect her. That night, when Collins had dragged Emily into the station, she had seen the spark of defiance in the girl's eyes. It had reminded her of herself when she was younger. She had fought the system, just as Emily was now. The difference was, Emily didn't have the luxury of being a part of the system. She was fighting from the outside, without the resources or the connections that Rachel had relied on. That thought brought Rachel's focus back to the present. Emily was the reason she was doing this, but so was the memory of the countless others who had fallen victim to Collins's cruelty. The past could not be undone, but the future could still be shaped. And Rachel was determined to make sure that Collins would never harm anyone again. "We're ready," Rachel said, her voice steady as she looked at Nathan. "Let's end this." Nathan gave a single nod, his eyes reflecting the same fire of resolve that burned in her own. They knew the path ahead was treacherous, but it was the only path worth walking. They were going after Collins, but it wasn't just his career that was at stake. It was everything, the entire foundation of trust and justice in their community. If they succeeded, it would be a victory not just for them, but for everyone who had been hurt by the system's failures. If they failed, well, Rachel wasn't going to think about that right now. They couldn't afford to. The final confrontation was drawing near, and everything had been set in motion. Rachel couldn't help but think of Emily again. The young woman had already endured so much, yet here she was, standing at the precipice of something much bigger than herself. This fight, this battle, wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had suffered in silence, for everyone who had been overlooked, for everyone who had been targeted unjustly. Rachel knew that whatever happened next, they would never be the same. But she had to believe it would be worth it. They had to bring Collins down, and this time, nothing was going to stop them. The clock on the wall ticked with a rhythmic precision, its sound echoing in the otherwise silent room. Rachel Harper and Nathan Carter stood side by side, staring at the door leading to the interrogation room where Officer Collins was waiting. Rachel's pulse quickened, her fingers flexing as if to release some of the tension that had been building up for hours. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the stakes higher than they had ever been. This was the moment they had been working toward, the culmination of all their efforts. "Are you sure about this?" Nathan's voice cut through the silence, a hint of doubt lingering in his words despite the resolve in his eyes. Rachel turned to him, her expression unwavering. "We've done everything we can. Now it's time to let Collins think he's won. He's been manipulating people for far too long. But today it ends." Nathan nodded, his jaw tightening in agreement. He had been by her side through it all, offering support when it was needed, and now they were about to confront the man who had brought them all to this breaking point. Rachel knew that Nathan was just as determined as she was to see this through, but she also knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Collins was a master manipulator, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. "All right," Nathan said after a long pause. "Let's get this done." Together, they walked towards the interrogation room, each step filled with the heavy weight of the task ahead. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, a constant reminder of the sterile, unforgiving environment they were in. As they approached the door, Rachel could hear the muffled voices of the officers inside, preparing Collins for what was about to come. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door, stepping into the room with Nathan by her side. Collins was sitting at the table, his posture relaxed, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had no idea what was coming. "Officer Collins," Rachel began, her voice cold and authoritative, "you've been the subject of an investigation for the past few days. We've gathered all the evidence we need." Collins raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "Is that so?" he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure you've got your hands full, but you're wasting your time." Rachel didn't flinch. "We know what you've been doing. We have surveillance footage, witness statements, and phone records. We have everything we need to bring you down." At her words, Collins's expression faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think I'm scared of your little investigation? You don't have anything on me." Nathan stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Collins with a cold intensity. "You're wrong, Collins. We have everything. The footage from the night Emily was arrested, the reports from your fellow officers, and the testimony from your colleagues. You've been manipulating the system for far too long. It's over." Rachel could see the shift in Collins's demeanor. His bravado was slipping, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But he wasn't about to admit defeat just yet. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his voice rising with anger. "I've done nothing wrong." Rachel stepped closer, her voice lowering but gaining in intensity. "We know about the connections you've been making behind closed doors, Collins. The people you've been working with. The ones who have been covering for you. We know about the bribes, the manipulation, and the abuse of power." For a moment, there was silence in the room. Collins's face grew pale, his eyes flicking nervously to the door as if hoping for an escape. But there was no way out now. The walls were closing in around him, and he knew it. Rachel could feel the tension building in the room as she waited for Collins to crack, to finally admit what he had done. But instead of backing down, Collins clenched his fists, his face hardening. "You can't do this. You don't have the authority to take me down. You're just a cop like me. You can't win." Rachel's voice was sharp as she leaned in closer. "That's where you're wrong, Collins. I'm not just a cop. I'm a woman who has seen how people like you destroy lives. And I'm not going to stop until I make sure you can never hurt anyone again." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rachel knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself or Nathan anymore. This wasn't about getting revenge for Emily's suffering or taking down one corrupt officer. It was about taking down a system that had allowed this kind of abuse to continue unchecked for so long. Collins's hands shook slightly, and Rachel could see the fear in his eyes now. He was starting to realize the gravity of his situation. His empire was crumbling, and there was no escape. But he wasn't about to give up without a fight. "Do you think you're the first person to try and take me down?" Collins sneered. "I've been in this game too long. People like you don't stand a chance." Rachel's eyes narrowed, her voice steady as she responded, "You're right. People like me have been fighting this fight for too long. And we're not going to let people like you keep getting away with it." She turned to Nathan, signaling for him to start the next phase of their plan. Nathan stepped forward, his face hard with determination. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a flash drive, placing it on the table in front of Collins. "You think we don't have anything on you?" Nathan said, his voice cold. "This flash drive contains everything we've gathered. Your every move. The bribes, the illegal activity, the corruption within the department. We've got everything." Collins's face drained of color as he looked at the flash drive. He knew what it meant. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. He was trapped. Rachel stood tall, her eyes locked on Collins. "You can either take the fall for everything you've done, or you can make things right. But either way, your time is up." For the first time since they had entered the room, Collins's smug demeanor faltered completely. He looked around, his breathing shallow, his chest tight. He could feel the weight of his past actions pressing down on him like a vice. Collins began, his voice wavering. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was just the way things worked. The system was broken, and I was just trying to survive." Rachel's eyes remained hard, but a flicker of something else passed through her. "Survive? You thought ruining lives was survival? You thought abusing your power was justified?" Collins didn't answer. He couldn't. For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Rachel could feel her pulse racing, but she didn't let it show. This was the moment they had been waiting for. It was time to end it. "Collins," Nathan said quietly, his voice filled with finality, "your reign is over." The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above felt almost deafening in the sterile interrogation room. Collins had been sitting in silence for what seemed like an eternity. His eyes darted from the flash drive on the table to Rachel and Nathan standing before him. They had him cornered, and deep down, Collins knew it. The bravado that had once been his armor had vanished, replaced by a palpable fear that gripped his chest. It was the moment of truth. He could either stand tall and continue the fight, or he could fold and accept the consequences of his actions. He shifted in his seat, running a shaky hand through his hair. The realization was setting in now. There was no way out. For the first time, Collins truly understood the weight of his position. He had spent years hiding behind lies, exploiting the system for his own gain, and now it was all coming crashing down. The carefully constructed world he had built for himself was crumbling, piece by piece. "Look," Collins finally spoke, his voice strained, I never meant for it to get this far. It started small, just a few favors here and there. I thought I could control it." Rachel's gaze never wavered from Collins as she leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "That's the problem, Collins. You thought you could control it. You thought you could get away with hurting people without any consequences. But people like you never understand the damage you do until it's too late." Nathan stepped closer to the table, his eyes narrowing. "You've been hiding behind your badge for far too long, Collins. You've used your position to manipulate, to hurt, and to tear families apart. You thought you were untouchable, but now the truth is coming out." Collins's face twisted into a grimace. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I didn't think it would come to this. But I've worked with powerful people, and they're going to protect me. They'll make sure this whole thing gets swept under the rug." Rachel's voice dropped lower, cold and calculating. "Not this time, Collins. You've gone too far. You're not going to be protected by anyone. The evidence we have, the lives you've ruined, they're not going to be erased with a few phone calls." Collins clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. His options were running out, and the fear was starting to bubble to the surface. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now the tables had turned, and he was just another pawn in a game that he couldn't win. "You think this is about some small-town corruption?" Collins spat, his voice tinged with desperation. "This is bigger than you know. You have no idea who you're messing with. The people I've worked with." Rachel interrupted him, her voice calm but filled with finality. "I don't care who you've worked with. What matters is what you've done. What matters is the lives you've destroyed." Collins looked between Nathan and Rachel, his mind racing. He had spent years in the department, climbing the ranks, building connections with people who were more than willing to cover his tracks. But now, none of that seemed to matter. He was facing real consequences, and for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely scared. "I know you want to take me down," Collins continued, his tone shifting slightly. "But I can't go down for this. I've worked too hard, too long to let it all slip away. Please, I'll do anything to make this go away." Nathan's gaze softened slightly, but only for a moment. "You don't get to make demands, Collins. You've already made your choices. Now it's time for you to face them." There was a long silence in the room as Rachel watched Collins closely. She had seen the fear, the panic in his eyes, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he broke. Collins had lived his life pretending to be above reproach, but now he was standing on the edge, his entire world threatening to collapse. This was the moment that would define him. Would he take responsibility for his actions, or would he continue to fight, dragging others down with him? Finally, Collins let out a long, shaky breath. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying. I didn't think anyone would ever catch on. But now I see the damage I've done." Rachel leaned forward, her voice steady. "You have the chance to make this right, Collins. But you need to come clean. Everything. No more lies, no more excuses." Collins's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he seemed to age a few years in an instant. The fight had drained out of him, and there was nothing left to do but admit the truth. He had underestimated the determination of the people standing before him, and now he would have to face the consequences. "I've been working with people who have connections far beyond what you could ever understand," Collins admitted, his voice small now, almost defeated. "I've been helping them cover up their tracks. They wanted to make sure certain people were arrested, certain cases were overlooked. They wanted to control the system, to make sure the powerful people stayed in charge." Nathan nodded slowly, taking in every word. "And you thought you could control it. You thought you could get away with it." Collins lowered his head, unable to look them in the eye anymore. "I thought I could. I thought I was untouchable." Rachel's eyes hardened. "You're not untouchable, Collins. No one is." With a deep breath, Collins looked up, his voice shaky but filled with resolve. "All right. I'll tell you everything. I'll name names. I'll tell you everything I've done, everything I've covered up. But you need to promise me one thing." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That you'll protect me," Collins said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what's coming after me. The people I've worked with, they won't just let this go." Rachel exchanged a glance with Nathan. She had no illusions about what would happen next. Collins had dug his own grave, and there was no protecting him from the people he had betrayed. But she knew that this was the final step in bringing him to justice. It was time to make sure he paid for everything he had done. "You'll get no protection from us, Collins," Rachel said firmly. "You made your bed. Now you'll lie in it." Collins's face fell, the weight of the realization hitting him hard. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. He had betrayed the very system he had sworn to uphold, and now the consequences would be dire. The interrogation room was silent, save for the occasional sound of the buzzing lights above. Collins sat in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His confession had come too late, and now he had to live with the consequences. But as the door opened, his heart skipped a beat. A new figure entered the room, someone he had never expected to see. His boss, the person he had long hoped would shield him from everything, had just walked into the lion's den. "I told you not to get involved in this mess," the voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. Collins' boss, Officer Leonard Griggs, stood tall and intimidating, his cold eyes staring directly at Collins. Rachel and Nathan both stood up, their postures solid, unyielding. They had seen the look in Collins's eyes earlier, the fear, the regret. They had anticipated the confession, but they hadn't expected Griggs to appear in the room. Griggs was no stranger to corruption, his name whispered among the city's underground circles for years. He was a kingpin in a world of shadows, a man who had manipulated the system to his advantage for too long. Collins had been just another pawn in his game. "Griggs, what the hell are you doing here?" Nathan's voice was low but filled with authority. His eyes never left the new arrival. He knew this would be the moment that would define everything. The final stand against the system that had allowed people like Griggs to thrive. Griggs smirked, stepping forward slowly, his polished shoes clicking ominously on the cold floor. "I came to see how my good friend Collins was doing. I trust he's been cooperative." Collins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His body was betraying him. He had always admired Griggs's ruthless tactics, but now, standing face to face with a man, he realized just how much he had underestimated the true cost of loyalty to someone like him. Rachel, who had been silent up until that point, stepped forward. Her voice was like ice, her eyes cold as she addressed Griggs. "You've been pulling strings for too long, Griggs. It's over. We've got everything. Your empire is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Griggs's smile faded slightly, replaced by a flash of anger. "You think you've won, don't you?" he sneered, his voice rising. "You're just another cog in the machine. What makes you think you're any different from me? You think you can expose me? I've got more power than you'll ever understand." Collins's heart raced, the weight of his betrayal now crashing down on him. He had never truly understood the full extent of Griggs's power. And now, as he looked between Nathan and Rachel, he realized just how dangerous this confrontation was. He had aligned himself with a man who had made countless enemies, and now those enemies were about to close in. Nathan stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with determination. "You've made a lot of mistakes, Griggs. And now it's time to pay for them. This isn't about power. This is about justice. And you'll answer for everything you've done. There's nowhere left for you to hide." Griggs's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that, but he couldn't deny the truth behind Nathan's words. The walls were closing in, and for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. "Do you know who I am?" Griggs hissed, his voice a low growl. "You think you can just bring me down? I've made people disappear. I've erased people from existence. I've pulled strings in places you wouldn't dare to dream of." Rachel's expression didn't change. "We're not afraid of you, Griggs. We've already gathered everything we need. You're finished." For a moment, Griggs stood there, his mind working over the possibilities, the outcomes. He had never expected it to end like this. The smug confidence he had carried for so many years was now gone, replaced with a bitter taste of fear. Then, as if realizing the futility of resistance, he laughed. It was a bitter, humorless laugh that echoed off the walls. "You think you've won, but you're not dealing with just any man. You're dealing with someone who's above the law. You can't stop me." Nathan exchanged a look with Rachel, his jaw set. "The law is going to stop you, Griggs. And when it does, you won't just be arrested. You'll pay the price for every life you've destroyed." Griggs's eyes flicked to Collins, who sat in his chair, barely able to look anyone in the eye. He had been loyal to this man for years, but now, as the reality set in, he realized just how much Griggs had used him. How much he had sacrificed for someone who was ultimately nothing more than a parasite feeding off the system. "Collins," Griggs called, his voice filled with a dangerous edge. "You've betrayed me, haven't you? You didn't think I'd find out." Collins swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't mean to. It just went too far. I thought you would protect me, but I see now that I was just a tool." The words stung more than Collins expected. The man he had once idolized, the man he had trusted more than anyone, had turned out to be just another criminal in a suit. Griggs turned toward him, fury flashing in his eyes. "You think you're going to get out of this? You'll be lucky if you ever walk free again. You've signed your own death warrant." Rachel's expression remained firm, her resolve unshaken. "Your threats don't scare us anymore, Griggs. You're finished." Griggs hesitated for a moment, his face contorting with rage. But then he took a deep breath, his demeanor shifting back to the cold, calculated figure he had always been. He turned toward the door, his words lingering in the room like a warning. "This isn't over," he said, his voice quiet but dripping with malice. "You've made a powerful enemy today, and when I come back, you'll regret ever crossing me." As he left the room, the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Collins slumped in his chair, his hands trembling. He had just made the ultimate mistake, betraying a man who would stop at nothing to protect his power. He knew what Griggs was capable of, and now there was no way to escape the storm that was coming. Nathan and Rachel stood in the room, their expressions unreadable. They had faced the storm, and now they were standing in the aftermath. Collins had given them what they needed, but the danger was far from over. Griggs would stop at nothing to protect himself, and now they had to prepare for whatever came next. Rachel turned to Nathan. "We can't let him get away with this. We need to move fast." Nathan nodded, his eyes steely with determination. "We will. This ends today." The sound of rushing footsteps echoed through the narrow corridor as Nathan and Rachel prepared for their final move. The air was thick with tension, every step bringing them closer to an inevitable confrontation with Griggs. They knew that time was running out. The case against Griggs was solid, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who had been protecting him? Who else was involved in his corrupt network? And most importantly, how far would he go to protect himself? Rachel leaned over the table in the small operations room, her fingers moving swiftly over the case files. She paused, her gaze landing on the photos of Griggs and his known associates. Her mind raced as she considered the implications of everything they had uncovered. This wasn't just a case of corruption. It was an entire system, a web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal that reached deep into the heart of the city's government. Nathan stood by the window, his eyes scanning the streets below. It was late, the city bathed in the pale glow of streetlights, casting long shadows over the deserted roads. The calm before the storm. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Griggs had always been a master at staying one step ahead, but this time things were different. This time, Nathan wasn't alone. "We have one shot at this," Nathan said, his voice low and determined. "We take him down now, or we risk losing everything. We can't let him escape. Not this time." Rachel nodded, her jaw set. "We've gathered enough evidence. Griggs can't hide behind his connections anymore. We'll bring him to justice, even if we have to do it ourselves." The room fell silent as they both considered the gravity of what they were about to do. There were no guarantees, no second chances. Griggs was dangerous, and his reach extended far beyond what they had anticipated. But Nathan and Rachel had come too far to back down now. They had seen the corruption, felt its grip tightening around the city, and now they were ready to do whatever it took to tear it down. As they walked out of the operations room, they were joined by their team. Everyone was on edge, the tension palpable in the air. They had planned every move carefully, anticipating every possible outcome, but there was always an element of uncertainty in a mission like this. They had no idea what Griggs would do when cornered, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. Rachel turned to the team leader, a seasoned agent named Mason, who had been with Nathan through countless operations. His expression was grim, but his eyes were filled with resolve. "Are we ready?" Rachel asked. Mason gave a curt nod. "We've got everything we need. Griggs's network is wide, but we've isolated him. He doesn't know it yet, but he's already lost. We've got eyes on him. No escape." Nathan took a deep breath, his mind sharp. "We move in now. We've got the element of surprise, and that's our advantage. We go in, get him, and don't give him a chance to react." The team made their way to the vehicles, their movements synchronized and swift. They were ready, and Griggs, wherever he was about to find out that the law had finally caught up with him. It was the dead of night when they arrived at the location. The city seemed eerily quiet, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. Nathan and Rachel's team set up their positions around the building. They were closing in on Griggs's hideout, the place where he had orchestrated his entire criminal empire for years. They had tracked him to this location, and now there was no turning back. The plan was simple: surround the building, breach it quickly, and apprehend Griggs before he had a chance to flee. But as Nathan looked at the building's silhouette against the dark sky, something didn't feel right. There was an unnatural stillness to the scene. "Be careful," Nathan said quietly to his team. "We don't know what we're walking into." Rachel glanced at him, her eyes steady. "We'll be fine. We've come too far to turn back now." Nathan gave a tight nod and motioned for the team to move forward. They approached the building cautiously, their steps quiet but determined. Every window, every shadow could be hiding someone, something. But they had a job to do, and they wouldn't hesitate. As they reached the front door, Rachel's hand hovered over the door handle, ready to move. A flash of movement caught her eye. The door creaked open slightly, revealing an empty hallway beyond. They had expected resistance, but the building seemed deserted. "Something's wrong," Rachel whispered, her voice tense. Nathan motioned for her to stay alert. "Proceed with caution. We're not taking any chances." They moved through the darkened halls, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Every room they passed was empty, silent. It felt like a trap, but where was Griggs? Where were the guards? The security? The sudden sound of a door slamming shut in the distance made them all freeze. "Stay sharp," Nathan commanded. The team fanned out, searching for any signs of Griggs's presence. They had come too far to be careless now. The hunt was on. Rachel took the lead, her gun drawn and ready. The group moved like shadows, their focus unwavering. They checked every room, every corner, but still no sign of Griggs. They reached the final door at the end of the hallway, a large wooden door reinforced with metal. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. Nathan signaled for them to prepare, and with a single motion they burst through the door, weapons raised. Inside, they found what they had been searching for. Griggs stood in the center of the room, a smug smile playing on his lips. His arms were crossed, and he was surrounded by a small group of his most loyal followers, people who had been working for him, helping him hide in plain sight. But there was something different this time. Griggs wasn't afraid. In fact, he seemed almost confident. "So," Griggs said, his voice cold and mocking, "you think you've won, don't you? You think you can just walk in here and arrest me? Well, you're wrong." Nathan's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "It's over, Griggs. You've run out of places to hide." But Griggs's smirk never wavered. "You think I'm hiding?" "No, Nathan. I've already planned for this. I knew you'd come for me eventually. But this is where your little mission ends." Before Nathan or Rachel could react, the room's lights flickered, and the unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed in the hallway outside. A trap. Griggs had set one final ambush. The night had fallen heavy and quiet. The streets that had once been alive with the noises of a bustling city now seemed to fall under the weight of an unspoken tension. Inside the dim-lit office, Nathan Carter stood before the mirror, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie. The situation had spiraled so far out of control, and the inevitable reckoning was now upon him. The events of the past few days weighed on him like a lead anchor. His daughter, Emily, had been humiliated by the racist cop, Lisa Harper, and in some ways that humiliation had opened a door to a larger conspiracy, a string of police corruption that ran deeper than he ever imagined. As Emily had faced her pain, so too had he been forced to confront the system that allowed people like Lisa Harper to exist unchecked. Nathan wiped his brow and took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to do would change the course of many lives, including his own. The decision to confront the higher-ups had been a difficult one, but it was the only option left. There was no other way to make things right. With one last glance in the mirror, he turned and walked out of the office. His heart pounded in his chest, knowing that the storm he had just set in motion would soon be unleashed. He stepped into the waiting car, the sleek black sedan blending into the shadows of the night. The driver, a trusted ally in the mission to expose the rot within the system, nodded wordlessly as they began the journey. The ride was a blur of thoughts. His mind raced with possibilities, questions that had no answers yet. Emily had come to terms with her own humiliation, but what about the broader picture? The corrupt officers, the compromised judges, and those in power who would stop at nothing to protect their own. Would they resist? Would they come after him, after his family, when the truth was laid bare? Nathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and checked the message. It was from Emily. "Dad, I'm okay. We'll get through this. Whatever happens, don't forget that your strength is my strength." Her words were a reminder of why he had to do this. For her. For the truth. For all the lives that had been ruined by the system's indifference to justice. As the car approached the downtown district, the streets grew darker, the lights from the high-rise buildings casting long shadows. Nathan felt the weight of history on his shoulders. The actions of one person, one decision, could change everything. It could topple the entire establishment, or it could lead to his downfall. But there was no going back now. The car finally stopped in front of the imposing building, the headquarters of the city's law enforcement. Nathan's hand tightened around the door handle, his nerves coursing with a mix of dread and determination. He stepped out into the cold night air, his breath coming in visible puffs as he made his way to the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him as he walked through the marble halls, his footsteps echoing off the walls. His destination was clear, the office of the police commissioner. The commissioner was one of the highest-ranking officers in the department, and his influence stretched across the entire city. He was the puppet master pulling the strings, the one who knew all the dark secrets. And Nathan had come to confront him. As Nathan entered the office, the commissioner looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. He was a tall man, with cold eyes that had seen too much. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just gestured for Nathan to sit. "I assume you've come here for a reason, Carter," the commissioner said, his voice as smooth as silk. Nathan didn't hesitate. He placed a file on the desk and slid it across to him. "I've come to expose the rot in this department. It's time for the truth to come out." The commissioner didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed as he studied the file. Inside were photographs, documents, and testimonies, irrefutable evidence of the corruption that had festered within the department. But Nathan knew that merely handing over the file wasn't enough. The commissioner wasn't a man who could be intimidated by paperwork. "Is this all you have, Carter?" the commissioner asked, his tone dismissive. "You think this will change anything?" Nathan leaned forward, his voice steady. "It's not just the paperwork. It's everything I've gathered. It's the fact that people like you think they can get away with ruining lives without facing any consequences. This ends tonight." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the commissioner's face. He stood and walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. "You have no idea what you're getting into," the commissioner said quietly. "The people you're up against, they don't play by the rules. You'll be crushed before you even know what hit you." Nathan remained calm, but his resolve only grew stronger. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of your people. And I'm sure as hell not afraid of the consequences. This ends now. You can't intimidate me. You can't silence me anymore." The commissioner turned to face him, his expression dark. "You think you're the hero here, Carter? You think you're some kind of savior? You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. The sooner you realize that, the better." Nathan stood up, his eyes burning with a fire that had only grown over the years of fighting injustice. "I'm done playing games. It's over." Without another word, Nathan turned and walked out of the office, leaving the commissioner to contemplate the reality of the situation. The storm had already begun, and there was no stopping it now. The last few moments of the trial felt like an eternity. Emily Carter, though exhausted from the days of grueling testimony and emotional strain, stood tall, her heart racing but her demeanor strong. The final verdict had been delivered. Jameson, the officer who had so cruelly wronged her, was now facing justice. The gavel fell with a thunderous sound, and Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her, though there was no immediate celebration in her mind. This moment was only the beginning, not the end. Nathan Carter, her father, stood beside her as the courtroom began to clear. He had always taught her how to stand up for herself, how to keep pushing forward, even in the face of the most terrifying obstacles. But in this moment, Nathan's gaze was more than proud. It was filled with a sorrow that couldn't be hidden. He had been her protector, her guide, but this battle had been more than he could have ever imagined. They had both gone through hell, and now they were just beginning to understand the weight of the fight ahead. For the last few months, they had been fighting a system that had hurt her, a system that had tried to break her spirit. Now, Emily had stood her ground and brought justice to the forefront, but this victory was not going to be enough for her. She knew she had just taken the first step in a long journey, one that would take not just her, but everyone who had suffered because of the system, to new heights. This wasn't just about one cop who had been held accountable for his actions. It was about a larger mission to rebuild the broken system. As they left the courthouse, the flashing cameras and the shouting of reporters seemed to close in on her, suffocating her for a moment. Emily had never asked for the spotlight. All she had wanted was to reclaim her dignity and to live her life without fear of being judged for the color of her skin. But now she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the justice system, but also a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for far too long. Emily's footsteps echoed as she walked out into the bright light of the cameras. Her emotions were conflicted. There was a deep, simmering anger at the world that had failed her for so long, and yet there was a quiet sense of pride that she had done what so many could not. She had fought against a system that had tried to break her, and for once she had won. But the victory didn't feel like a final destination. It felt like a stepping stone to something far larger. As she and Nathan walked toward their car, they didn't speak. Emily knew what her father was thinking. He was proud, but he was also scared. The world had changed in the last few days, and neither of them knew exactly what would happen next. She wasn't just the daughter of a prominent federal agent anymore. She was Emily Carter, a symbol of resistance. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she understood the weight of that responsibility more than anyone else. Emily settled into the passenger seat, looking out of the window as the city unfolded before her. It was a city full of life, but also one full of deep, unresolved pain. Her journey, she realized, had only just begun. She had a voice now, one that people were listening to, and it was her duty to make sure that it was heard. The injustices that had shaped her life could not be undone, but if her voice could help even one person avoid the pain that she had been through, then it would be worth everything. Her thoughts were interrupted by her father's voice. "You did it, Em," Nathan said quietly, his tone a mix of pride and exhaustion. "You stood your ground. You've made a difference." Emily turned to face him, her expression softening. She had been so focused on the endgame that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the journey it had taken to get here. Her father had been her rock through all of this, but now she felt like she was the one holding him up. She had always relied on his strength, but in this moment she realized that it was her own strength that had carried them both through. "I'm not done yet," Emily replied, her voice steady, though there was a fierceness beneath it. "This is just the beginning. We've taken down one person, but there are so many more that need to be held accountable. This whole system needs to change." Nathan nodded. He understood. But he also knew that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be long, painful, and filled with obstacles at every turn. Emily had made it this far, but the world was still full of people who would try to tear her down, people who wanted to see her fail. It was something he had experienced firsthand as a federal agent, but now it was his daughter who was in the line of fire. As they drove through the city, Emily's mind raced. She thought about all the people who had been watching her story unfold, the people who had been following every step of her journey, those who had reached out with messages of support, and those who had offered words of encouragement when things seemed impossible. There were so many people like her, people who had been wronged by the system, people who had been pushed to the edge of despair, but had still found the strength to keep going. But the road ahead was still full of questions. How would she use this newfound platform? Would she be able to make a real difference? The answer wasn't clear. But what she did know, what she understood in her bones, was that she couldn't stop. The system was broken, and as long as there were people like her, people who had been oppressed and abused by those in power, the fight for justice would continue. It wasn't just about changing laws. It was about changing hearts and minds. "I've made my peace with what's happened," Emily said after a long silence. "But what happens next is even more important. The people who have been hurt need to know that they're not alone. They need to know that they can fight back and win. That's the real message we need to send." Nathan looked at her, his face illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. "And you're the one to send it." As they pulled up to their house, Emily felt a sense of calm wash over her, even though she knew the next chapter would be just as difficult. This was her life now. She had to be a leader, a voice for the voiceless. And though she felt a sense of duty to continue her fight, she also knew that she couldn't do it alone. The truth was, Emily's fight wasn't just about her own suffering. It was about everyone who had been marginalized, everyone who had been oppressed and ignored by those in power. It was about the people who had been silenced for so long, and it was her duty to make sure that their stories were heard. Inside, the house felt like a sanctuary. Emily and Nathan settled into their usual spots, each lost in their own thoughts. Emily stared at the wall, but her mind was a million miles away, her heart still heavy with everything that had happened. But she was also filled with a quiet determination, a sense that something had shifted. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She wasn't just someone who had been hurt. She was a fighter, a force of nature that could not be stopped. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She picked it up, seeing a message from a friend, but it wasn't the message that caught her attention. It was the fact that the message came with a new opportunity, a chance to get involved in a national campaign against racial profiling and injustice. This was it. This was what she had been waiting for. "I'm ready," Emily said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Nathan looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "We're in this together. Whatever comes next, we're going to face it head-on." And for the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of peace. She had come a long way, but the road ahead, though uncertain, was one she was ready to walk.